Hi, everybody. Um, we've got, I'm going to talk a little bit about this coming up, but this is basically how I've been doing at work with trying to handle configuring multiple apps for multiple clients. So I'm calling it white labeling. It's maybe a little bit, it's not just, what you would think of with white labeling. It's a little more than that with configuration. So let's start off with who I am. Hi, that's me. And I'm the lead Flutter developer at a company called Ardley. And I'll talk about that in a second. I'm actually, if any of you were on my panel earlier, thank you for coming. We had a Flutteristas panel talking about that. I'm very proud to be one of the lead organizers of the Flutteristas. I'm a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, which is right in the middle of the United States. And that's where I grew up. So that was kind of neat. And I'm an avid photographer. So if you all can see the back of my my MacBook, when I just did a boot camp at the University of Oklahoma on Flutter. And I told them, I said, I care about two things, Flutter and OU. And I showed them the back of my my MacBook to prove that. So, all right, the company I work for is Ardley. We're a fintech startup. And basically what we do is we help the mortgage industry in the United States is a little bit weird at times, but we help try to keep, we work for the servicers, but we try to help the people that are going to want to refinance because the rates got lower or because they need to take cash out or whatever. We help them keep their people, and we help those people fill out the forms. And that's why the different companies have different questions and the different products have different questions. And that's why we have to be able to do all that kind of stuff. And we're using Flutter Web because if you think about applying for a mortgage, that's usually kind of like a one-time thing. You may do it multiple times in your life, but you're only doing it once now. So having someone download an app is not really a good idea. So we use Flutter Web, even though it's 100% just an app, but because of the beauty of Flutter, we run it on the web. And so basically what we've got many clients, we've got many products. And so we're trying to mix all of those together to make stuff happen. And that's why we're here talking about that. So I'm just giving you a little bit of an example here. These are just straight off our Figma page for Woodley Bank, by the way, is a fake client, so I can talk about them. It's what we use to demo things with. I can't talk about the actual real companies that they're using us, but I'm just showing you like here are like 3 different products / landing pages that we have, and you can see they all have differences that have to be configured to make it work right. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about a little bit about customizing the build process so the experience can be created as automatically as possible. We're going to talk about customizing UI with, the things like logos and images, for like the landing page and the splash page, stuff like that. And then here's what we're really going to talk about is how I customize the flow of the application. So if you think about filling out a bunch of papers to try to get a mortgage or a loan or something like that, and if we have anybody here that doesn't know what a mortgage is, it's basically a loan to buy a house with. And so if you think about doing all of that, it's basically just filling out a form. We're collecting data. We may be guiding you with help tips or things like that to get you there, but we're basically controlling and having you enter the data. For different products, the validation might be different. For sure, the questions are different, things like that. So that's why we have to go about customizing all of that and make that happen. Because my stuff is highly configuration driven, testing can be a problem. So we're going to briefly talk about that, of what we do with testing. And then we're going to see if we can live the dream and basically create a single app that can, phone home and find out exactly what it is that we want to do, how to display itself, things like that. And so we'll talk about seeing if we can achieve that. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, I haven't yet, but I've got ideas. So we're going to talk about that. So this is kind of a little bit of a cop-out slide, but to automate stuff, we use CI/CD. And we're deploying on AWS. There's great Flutter solutions. There's other reasons in the company I'm using AWS for this. But there's awesome solutions. I think CodeMagic's a good one, things like that are out there that can help with the deployment script. So if you script it all up and you make it all where when you're building it, it's building automatically when you create a release, when you merge your PR into a branch. If you can make it automatically deploy and do that, that helps a lot with making this happen. And we're using GitHub Actions to handle that. And so because we are on the web with it, we definitely have to make stuff. We have to make separate we don't necessarily have to make separate builds. We are right now, but they definitely have to be deployed to different places. And so we've got our operations team has set up some matrices, so it'll go there and it'll say, here's how all I build things. I need to build this because this, I've got a mono repo. So, this part of the mono repo changed. So I have to build this product, things like that. And then it automatically puts it out on AWS. There are a couple of things that you're going to have to inject at some point into your app. In our case, it's our server that we're talking to, because otherwise, if you don't know the server, you don't know where to go talk to, and also the API key. And the API key identifies which merchant this is. And so there's no way around that. That has to be baked into your application. And so I'm just using Dart defines with that and passing it in. And so that's how we get that in there. But all of the rest of the configuration ought to be able to be received from an API call. And that's what I would like to do for that. I'm not there yet. And I'll talk about where I'm not and where things can change. The second thing we're going to talk about is, what I showed you earlier was a landing page. It's the first screen that shows up, and they use it to select there may be multiple products. They use it to select which product they want, things like that. So for this, we're starting off with, you want to definitely use good Flutter practices. So you want to create reusable widgets, the building blocks to be able to build stuff with. So an example of that might be like, I've got a logo row. And that logo row, except for what the actual logo and what the phone number is the same for all of them. It's got a number you can call for help, and it's got a logo at the top, and it goes across there. So that's really easy to use that logo for all of my products. That logo widget for all of my products. Some of them are not as easy. If you remember the landing pages I showed you, there were some definite differences with those. And some of those I'm able to still create like a marquee kind of thing with an image and the box. And I've got the padding and the margin on the box. So, I've got the ability to have one widget that can do lots of different configurations, and so if you're on a phone, it's going to look different, and I can still run that from that same widget. And so those are the kinds of things you want to look at. You want to try to go ahead and make it to where you've got, the code that you can reuse for it. And before you can configure it past that, you have to have that. Another thing you might not think about, but if I've got, each product has a different type of or each experience type has a different landing page it's going to show. I can't show you the landing page until I've received back my API call. So I have to have, got back what all I want to do. And so we've created a generic loading animation that helps us get by the time to be able to go do that, because otherwise you have a problem. And right now, or in general anyway, I guess no matter what, these generic widgets don't have the logo built into them, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to use that. So we need to inject that in. And so we inject that when I'm creating a landing page, I've got a branding object I pass into it. And so here's the current state of it. I'm still using custom code more than I would like. I'm still having to, each page actually has, a column, and I put the logo row, and I put maybe the marquee row, and I'm still building that way. So it's not really configured the way I would like to. It's a lot faster than it was originally, but I'm still taking a day or two to set up a new client experience, or more. And there's things other than that. I'm talking about the landing pages because that's the big picture I had to show you. But each product, for example, when you filled everything out and you want to show what it looks like, that's going to be different. Okay. And so the way I handle stuff like the application summary is with I'll have a builder, that you can pass in, and it knows how to create what it needs to. And the next steps are to be completely configurable. And so I'm working right now with our developers and designers to define well enough, here's how I lay things out. And once I've got that done, then I'll be able to create something where I can actually have a completely customizable experience that could be rebuilt without having to redeploy my code. Because that's another big part of this, is I want to be able to make changes without having to redeploy my code. And that's why you want to be able to make that call, that API call, and get back the current data. I mean, we could probably just listen to Eric and use Shorebird, but in this case, this is the way I would do that. So, all right. I told you all of that to talk about this. This is the part that I'm kind of proud of. I hope that you all appreciate it. But I've got a configurable form. And to do that, I've created an element that is sort of, it's not exactly the state, but it knows how to interact with the state. So it's, I'll show some examples as I go through building what we're doing, but it's able to be displayed by a widget, things like that. So we'll talk about that. It's able to collect the data that I need. That's obviously the point of my application, is to collect data. So it collects the data. And this is the question I was supposed to have answered. That's kind of fun. Okay, fine. How we configure what is included in a given form. I have a list of pages, and I have just basically element 1, 2, 3, 4, just like you would do in a column. They're just listed in there. And if I want to move it from one page to the other page, you just take it, lift it, and move it to the other page, and it automatically gets updated with that. There's some of that code I can't really show you like right now because we've got a guy back there that's filming it for us, and it's going to go all on the web. But if you find some of this interesting and you want to see some actual real code, I could show you some real code afterward, that I've got of how we're doing that. I'm going to show some samples here coming up, but if you want to see it in real use, I'm happy to do that. The way I'm doing it's a little bit agnostic of how you're maintaining your global state. I know that a lot of people fight about how you're doing state. It's a little bit agnostic of that. And the other thing I have to do for this is I have to have like a global mapping from, my state object to be able to talk to the API. That's not one-to-one. So I need to have a global mapping. And if I don't have it being global, where everything, I can always come in and out of it, then I have you have a problem because now you're once again having to customize things as you go along. Whereas if everything's in there, you're fine. So I've got a configuration class, and it contains the current value. So far it's not super helpful, but we got that. But it can also get the current value. It can get what value we want from our state object, and it can put it back once we've changed it and decided we want to change it. And so, we're going to start off with just a super simple little class. And the reason for change notifier, I'll talk about in a second, but that's, I've just created a configuration class here. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about is what's the type of component, we're dealing with. What is this a text field? Is this a select button? Is this what type of field is it? And so I've just created an enum to talk about this. So basically I've got an enum that I create that has all the different types of elements I want to be able to display. And then I've created a configurable widget that does a switch statement, and it says, okay, this is a text field. I'm going to show a text field. Now we're going to have a few more things we pass in with it, but that's what we're going to, that's how we do that. So here is like an example. This is way watered down, but this is an example of my data element types. And our company had made the decision, the designers made the decision that we're not using basically anything off the shelf. So I've got a text input, which is a text field that's wrapped with our style, with all the stuff we want to do on that. It has like an optional label, for example, things like that. And then we have a separate element for entering a date. We have a separate element for a social security number, which is, it's in the United States. It's like kind of an identification number. So it's a little bit private. And so we treat it mostly like a password, but kind of the standard is you put in like the first 3 digits, and then you put in the second 2 digits. And then when you put in the last 4 digits, it actually keeps those showing. So you can always see the last 4 digits. So it's a custom element. And so we've created that, as one of our things. All right. And so, obviously we add to our class, we add this data element type. Okay. And then I need to create for text input, I've got a stateful widget that wraps the text field. And it's combined with an optional label, so I can have it say that, you're entering your social security number here, and then have the field under it. If you noticed when I had the configuration class, it has a T in there, and that was scary for me when I first started trying to do it. It's not a big deal for people. It's just it just means that you've got a type, and it needs to be consistent with that type, but we don't care what the type is. And so for the case of a text input, T is a string. And then the listener builder is used to help force it to rebuild. So for example, let's say that you were entering a date, and you put in an invalid date. You put in like 3023 instead of 2023. That's going to, when we go to validate that's going to generate an error. It's going to then notify listeners. And so the widget knows to rebuild itself. And, listener builder is our friend. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's a little bit of what that configurable widget that I created looks like. And so in the build, all the build is it's a big switch with a case statement. And I'm passing in this configuration element to what we've created to show the text input. And so for this case, I need to have a value and a label. Okay. And so I kind of want to make this point here that T is not exactly in your state. If it was exactly in your state, we could probably just use the state object somehow, right? But we have cases where what the data we're collecting is not really the data that we're storing, you know? You have multiple values going into one state object, or you can have multiple values in the state coming into one element. And so we've got military service as an example here. So we have to ask, are you currently active in the military? And if you are, for example, I have to collect the information of when do you expect to get out, right? And so those are separate values up in my state because they're independent values that way, but I'm collecting them in the same place. And so, my widget that's doing that has to know about both of them. An opposite one was citizenship, where the way we're collecting that is a couple of Booleans. So we're collecting that, we're asking if you're, we ask if you're a U.S. citizen. And if you aren't, we say, are you, a permanent resident? And out of those two Booleans, I have to create an enum that says that you're a legal resident, you're a citizen, or you're not. So it's not, so once again, we're going to talk about how we make that happen. The one thing I have to say is if it is and this is true no matter where you are in your state, if it's a class, if you're actually passing around a class, be aware that, we pass by reference. So if you change that class, it's going to change it immediately, not when you want it to. And so in our case, you would want to make sure that's a copy. So, all right. So I've got the ability to show, ask you your first name, and it will go ahead and put in there, and you can type in your first name. But I might already have it. So that's an important thing, is how do I get the value that's currently in our state? How do I get the value in there? So I add to the configuration object, I add an application value, which is a method here. And this method, the workspace application, is basically our state object here. So it knows how to query that to get what it needs. Okay. And then lower down, and by the way, I don't really show it in here, but when you pass in the application value function, I don't want that to be visible to everybody else. So, I assign it to a private underscore application, for the function part. And so then I've got a getter here, or, it says reset from workspace. And basically it just sets the value equal to whatever's in the state right now. So whatever the function we passed in. So we control how it figures out what that is. So let's give a couple of examples here. That top example there would be like for my primary borrower's last name. Okay, well, it's very simple. That object exists in my state. So I can just copy that string over. No big deal. The second one's the more complex example, where that's what I was telling you about with the is a U.S. citizen. And I shortcutted my text a little bit just so you can see it a little better. But basically I say, if I have an answer to that question, if someone has said yes or no to I'm a U.S. citizen, then I go ahead and check for the, and I enter into this field, a citizenship field group, which has in it has their current status of if they're a U.S. citizen, and it has their current status if they're a permanent resident. And so that way the widget that's actually displaying this has access to both of them. And these are the current values. So I'm copying it from whatever was in state and I'm putting it there. And it could be null because you don't have to have a value already in state. So that's what the ternary is for. So now if we go back to my configurable widget, that stateful widget we had, in the init state now, I actually always call widget element reset from workspace. And we need a key for that because otherwise, you have the same, when you go to the next page, you'll have the same widget on that page that has everything looking the same. So it's a stateful widget, so it won't call init state again. And so we have to have a key. And I just use the value key of this configuration element. That works just fine for it. I'm a big fan of value keys. Okay, so what if I don't have a value in the state, but this client wants a default value? Okay. An example of this is I have a page that's a whole bunch of just checkboxes. Is this true? Is this true? Is this true? Okay. And some clients want me to default that to true. And some clients want me to default it to null with no value at all. Okay. So if I don't have a value already saved in my state, I need to have a default value. And so once again, I'm adding one of these methods because I might need to go into my state to find out what that default value should be. Okay, so I've got that, and this allows me to keep track of whether or not we've got default whether or not it's actually been entered or not entered is part of why I do that. So I leave it null in the state until it's actually been, affirmatively gotten something for it. And so since this is a nullable function, because it can return null, I just call it, my getter here just says default value ? Dot call, and I pass in the state object that I need to give it. So that way I can now have a default value. And so let's go back one more time to this configurable widget. And so I've now added a ? Equals, and I call the default value. And so that says that if I got a value from reset from workspace, great. If I didn't, let's go grab the default value. And if that's null, then no harm, no foul at that point. Okay, so now we've taken our stuff out of the state. We've put it back into state. And so now we've taken it out of state. We've got default value. Now we need obviously to put it back into the state object. Okay. And so it's the same kind of deal here. I've got I'm passing a function, what the value actually is. And I'm passing the function my state object so that it can actually it knows how to go put it back in there. And then I've just created a function down below of persist to workspace. And it that way, because your normal app doesn't have access to that state, or your normal widgets don't have access to that state object. That's kind of tight when I've created this. I've given it the ability to do that because I don't want everybody to have that. All right, so let's give a couple of examples for this. This is a very easy example. So in this case, this would be for an element that shows my primary borrower's first name. Super easy. I just set my primary borrower's first name equal to whatever the value is. Okay. But here's that one I was talking about with the U.S. citizen. I'm setting actually two values at this point, and I guess I am still using the booleans here. I'm not converting it to the enum here. I could, but so basically because I've got multiple values here because they were tied to that same element, I'm assigning both of them here. So this is just like what a slightly more complicated one would be. Now, just because I've got the ability for this element to go do that, we don't necessarily want to. I don't want other widgets to necessarily worry about how to do that. And so I have at one point I have a persist, as part of my further up in there. It's part of the navigation, and the navigation is going to validate. We'll talk about it in just a second. And then it's going to talk about, and if it validates, then it's going to persist everything. And all it does, it's very easy. It just goes through the list of elements for that page, and it persists them. Talks about is included. We'll talk about that in just a second. So that's the idea. So if the element was on the page, then we're going to go ahead and persist it. So we had that. Okay, fine. So is included. I just mentioned that there. Not every element's included every time. So if you're thinking about what we're doing, I've got a borrower. I might have a co-borrower. If I have a co-borrower, I might ask a separate question. So if I don't have a co-borrower, I don't want to ask that question because it makes no sense. And so I've created an is included. You're going to notice a pattern here. And so anytime that the elements on that page get rebuilt, it runs this is included function and says, should I be included or not? And if it should be included, then it actually does. And once again, Listener Builder is your friend for letting us know that changes have happened. We used to use Animation Builder, but they just gave us Listener Builder, which is the same thing. It's just, it sounds better. People don't ask quite, what are you talking about there? All right. So once again, so I've added a function here that can look at the state and say, should I include this one or not? All right. And then I've got a bool getter. You notice the pattern here of what I'm using. I'm very consistent with that, I think. And it just calls the function that it needs to call from inside of that. So let's do a couple of examples. My default is always included, so it just returns true no matter what. And then this is like when I talked about with if it has cobar, it's very easy. It just returns has cobar equal true. So that's in my state object. It tells me whether or not I'm going to want to include this or not when I'm building it. Here's another one that's a little bit different where I'm just I'm checking something else, but it's the same kind of idea. It's just a method that I've got. Right now, these are built with lambdas. We're going to talk about it in just a second. Okay. And I'm running way long. Okay, fine. All right. Displaying on the screen. The part of the page where this is being displayed is simply we're using code as UI here. So I've got a column. And inside of that, I've run through a for loop with all of the elements that are on that page. And if it's included, I create that configurable widget. These on, next, on, previous, and on submits are all related to navigation and routing. So it knows what buttons to put in there. Like, do I have a next and a previous? If it's the first element, I don't have a previous. It's the last element, it's going to be submit. things like that. So these are methods that are created as part of our routing system to know what to do. And once again, our elements should be agnostic of where they exist in the whole tree. So, all right, validation is another important one. It's the last important thing I'm talking about here on this part. And so basically, I've added a function in here that takes the value, it takes the workspace, and it takes. I formatted this by hand. I see I missed a return. And it takes something called meta. I guess I do have to talk about that still. And so sometimes there's extra things when we're validating, we want to tell it. So we're using the meta for that. And it's a function. And then we've got this. I made this on its own page. It's a little bit harder. But the idea basically here is I try to run validate. And by the way, this is one of my mistakes I made. I don't like this. I should have treated the errors a little bit differently. But the way that I did this was if there was an error in the element, I just returned the string of the error, that I wanted to show. And otherwise I returned null. And the problem is the fact that you might be able to guess, I now that I've got things that have more than one thing in it, how do I return multiple errors? So that makes life a little bit harder. So this is one thing I'm going to refactor at some point. But the idea is the fact that it checks to see that, and not every time you check to see if it's valid, do you want to actually generate errors. Okay, that's what the generate errors is for. Because, for example, on the left-hand side, I have a nav bar, and I want to show a green check mark if that whole section's fine, right? And so whenever I'm building that nav bar, it runs through all of the elements, and it decides whether it should put the green check mark or whether it doesn't, or whether it's even the current one or whatever. But it figures out how to display that. And the problem with that is the fact that, well, at that point, it's now generating, if you don't do this with telling it not to generate the errors, it's generating errors. So the first time you go to the page, it already has all the red on the page saying, well, you need to fill it, give me a value for this, give me a value for that, that kind of stuff. So that's why, depending on who's asking is whether or not we're actually going to generate an error. We're going to return whether it's an error or not, but whether we actually generate the errors happens that way. And so that's what that's going. And once again, if I am generating errors, I need to do a notify listener so that we can actually show them at the appropriate widget. Because for example, that social security number widget, if I try to validate that and I haven't put in 10 digits, it's going to show an error saying, please enter 10 digits. And so that's that. Okay. And then inside, once again, as part of that navigation where we're going to the next page, we want to go to the next page or previous page. Okay. We have to run through all the elements. And so this is once again very, very similar code in that I go through all the elements that are on this page and I query them to see if they are all valid. If any of them are invalid, then I'm not going to, for example, I'm not going to persist stuff, and I may not let you leave the page. I may want to show an error and say, I may not want to let you leave the page. So for example, if you're going backwards, I might let you go backwards, and you would just lose what you did. But if you're going forward, then I'm going to want to stop you and say, no, fix these errors first. And that page level validation I left in there right now because that's another kind of failure for me a little bit. I don't like. So, I'm trying to tell you the things I would like to fix as I go along. I may have multiple elements on a page that depend on each other. And if I haven't saved them back to the state, they don't know about each other. And so the page level validation actually can go through these elements and figure out what it's got to do to make sure I'm valid or not. And so that's something that I will at some point find a better way to do. So here's some examples of validation. My default validator is always valid. Put a value, don't put a value. Type XXX, type 123. I don't care. It's fine. And so that once again, it doesn't need any of our parameters, and it just returns. Remember, null means no error. A string means an error. All right. Another example here is basically, this is one of the most common ones. I don't really care what the value is, but you better put a value in. So this says that, so this gets the value and it checks and sees if the value is null, then you have to go back and add a value. And if it's not null, then you're fine. We're valid. And here's a much more complex example to kind of show what's going on here. So this is an element that has, this is basically a checkbox that you can checkbox and then put your phone number in to say, send me updates about the progress of my application. Okay. So in this case, we have, we check to see, did you put a phone number in? If you put a phone number, is it a valid phone number? If that's not the case, then I'm going to go ahead and tell you that there's an error in the phone number, and I'm going to add the error to my list of strings. And if you did do that, then, did you check mark the box? Because it makes no sense to hit the button saying I want to get updates and not check mark the box saying you can send me updates. And so this is showing kind of how the way I originally did it was not good enough. That's why this meta was there. So the final customizable thing I've got here is what I'm calling the metadata for that field. It allows specific configuration data for an element type. For example, you might have multiple labels because there's multiple parts to it. You might have individual errors like we just saw in the last one. If it's a text field, you might have input formatters that you're passing in. And it uses a base class just to standardize the method signatures. And I think patterns might help with this. I have not gone back and looked at that yet, but I think with the Dart 3 patterns might help me with that. So here's an example. So this is for my text input. And so our text input field has that little floating label. So I've got the main label in there, but it has a floating label. So I don't have a way in my main object to do that, and it's not always there. So I go ahead and I'm putting that there as an input label. It's got the ability to have a little suffix at the end of the label. That's, I've got that there, and it has the input formatters. And so this is just metadata that a text field input might want to have. And if it does have it, then, if it has a meta, it should be of this type. And here's another example. This is one where it's just got two different labels because it's got two different things I'm entering. In this case, basically I'm asking you if the property is a condo or not. And if it is a condo, I'm asking you what type of condo it is. So I might have an error if you didn't answer the property type. I might have an error if you have the if you needed one and you don't enter the condo description. And I've got the labels for both of them to display, as part of that goes. So like I said, I'm happy to show any of you afterwards if you want to see some real code with this, but I've got sections and pages, how it's organized. The section contains pages. A page knows how to validate itself. It knows how to write, it's got the list of elements and stuff like that. The section knows how to run through all the pages and sees if the page is valid, things like that. So a page is just a screen with elements and since the routing does have some business logic to it, but because I'm needing to create these things like to go to the next one, the previous one, things like that, it does appear in my widget tree above as the ability to do that. And those next, previous, and buttons are all injected. And entire sections could be excluded at runtime. Because, like, for example, I talked about having a co-bar. If you don't have a co-bar, there's no point in me showing you the list of questions on co-bar, even if I don't, because there's nothing on it, we don't want to show it. So that's something else I had done. And it also handles the exceptions. Like if you have errors when you're wanting to leave a page, it's what knows what to do about that, whether it's okay or not. So we've got other customizations I'm not going to talk about today, like help tips, that you can show on there. So those get built. Those are attached to either the page config if they're global to that page, or they get attached actually to the element if they're part of the element. And if there's multiple of the ones in the element, they get attached to the meta because of that. Triggers are another thing I'm not super happy about, but a trigger is something that happens if the page validates and I want to leave it. For example, let's say that you're validating you want to get an email code to validate your email, right? So I've got a page where you enter the email address, right? Well, the trigger after that's going to send off the API call saying, send them a code. The next page, you're going to enter the code. The trigger after that's going to say, validate the code. If it worked, it might say, go get me my current state. Now that you validated who you are, let's go get my current state. We have some full screen elements that actually, where they didn't want the normal navigation. And so I've got a way to handle that. So it's just, these are exceptions I've got that I'm not super happy with. And then, if all else fails, I've got the ability to actually build a page with the builder instead of an element, which I don't like that. I'm not using it now actually, but I still have that possibility. All right, we need to test things. And I'm running a little bit over. I have about 5 minutes left. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. But basically, to be able to test something, you need to be able to have a key to it, to get to it pretty much, especially because it's this custom. And since you can change like what the text is of the label, things like that, you can't even use, find by text or things like that. So you need to have a key. So we give everything a key. I use value keying strings for them all. So, because I can create unique strings for each what I need. And I just did this. This is just an extension on string I did. So that you can just say dot value key or question mark dot value key if it's nullable. And it actually will let you add a postfix to it. So like, for example, I'm gonna talk about address in a second. If I want to, I could just say, the address label question mark dot value key and give it the postfix of street to get the street address part of it. And so anyway, I did this. And part of why I did this is so that I can do that with question mark dot. So it makes, I don't have to go check to see if it's null and then not. If I make an extension to string, if the string's null, then it's going to return null, because you cannot have multiple keys on something. So be careful of that. And so what I did is I just added a debug label to my configuration that I use that, and then I mangle it as necessary. So an example with an address, maybe the widget that's building this thing gets passed in a base key string of mailing address, right? And so the street's going to be mailing address.street. The postal code is going to be mailing address.postal code, et cetera. Things like that. I think that's pretty clear. And that way I've now got a unique for everything there. And so if you think about it, in most cases, if you're not testing visuals and things like that, all you have to be able to do is get to an item and either tap it or enter text in. And if you can do that, then you can do most of your integration type testing, things like that. So that's why we've done it that way. All right. So can we live the dream? The dream for me would be I've got the same map everywhere with the exception of what I've injected with the API key and the API host. So the idea would be I make an API call, I get back a JSON file, we're done. If you've been watching us, okay, let's go this. So in that case, all assets have to be remote. So all the logos, for example, have to be remote, so that otherwise you won't be able to, otherwise you're including all of them in your every one of your things. So we make an API call to get the JSON. So far, so good. The problem is I'm using a lot of functions and lambdas, and you can't really serialize those. So that's why I haven't done this yet. And I've got an idea, but I don't like it. So I'm going to tell you all what it is. It's probably what I'm going to do if I can't figure out something better. But the idea is to have no lambdas. So I have functions for everything. So I have no inline lambdas. I create a function for everything. And then I can create maybe an enhanced enum for all of these functions. And then I can serialize. I can make that JSON. And I might want to go ahead and do multiple enums so that, because some of these had different signatures. And so I might go do that to make multiple enums to do that. And once I've done that, then I can JSON serialize it, and then I can get to that point. And maybe records can help, with some of that signature stuff. All right, so that's it. I went a little bit long. I'm sorry. I think I started a couple minutes late, but anyway, this is me. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this. I'm happy to actually, show you all some code. I just can't do it on camera, really, because it's our actual code, stuff like that. But I can show you how I'm using this and give examples of that. And so I'm a figure skater on Twitter, LinkedIn, Flutterfly, and I've got my YouTube channel. It's been pretty dormant, but after I'm done with this, I'm planning on starting to get back into doing that a lot more. So hopefully that'll come up and we can make that happen. And thank you all for coming, and for all of you that stayed, thank you for staying.